Okay, everyone. Time is now 2:05. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties due to causing the delay, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar titled Lighting Joins the IoT, Simplification and Energy Efficiency. I'm your event host, Timothy Johnson. I'm the digital editor for Electrical Contractor magazine. First, just some quick housekeeping items. Today's presentation uses the WebEx audio broadcast feature through your computer speakers or headphones. If you prefer to call in or if you experience any audio difficulties, there's a toll-free number in the chat window. If you have other technical difficulties through the presentation, you can reach out to me using the chat window, and I'll work with you to troubleshoot. Today's presentation is being recorded, so if you miss anything or if something comes up and you have to leave, you can come back to the presentation at your convenience. That will be available at least no later than 72 hours after the conclusion of today's event. So look for that. We'll have a short question and answer session at the end of the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can submit them through the Q&A chat box in the bottom right corner of your event window. Just to introduce today's presenter, we'll be hearing from John Casadante. John is a product marketing manager at Cree. He has over 20 years of technology marketing experience. In his current role at Cree, John drives thought leadership through participation in conferences, trade shows, and webinars. He works with agents and customers to stay ahead of market development trends. So with that, I just want to thank you all for your patience and for attending. And now I'm going to hand it over to John to get started. John?
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Glad you can join us this afternoon. Today's conversation will give you a little bit of background on how lighting fits into the Internet of Things, and most of you have probably heard that term. And I'd like to get started with a really quick survey, and the survey is just really plain and simple. It's when was the first time you remember hearing the term Internet of Things? And the selection options there are 2 years ago, last year, within this last year, or this is a new term to you altogether. We tend in the technology industry, we tend to change the terminology every couple of years, and you probably have been aware of the Internet of Things by using an IP phone or using something within your office place that actually utilizes the base technology. But we'll give you a minute here and give you an opportunity to go ahead and let us know what you think. So Tim, are we going to be able to see the results here?
Yeah, as soon as we conclude the poll, the results will come up.
Okay, so good. So I would like everybody to get an idea of where we fit. A little bit of background of where I'm coming from. So I'm based in Durham, North Carolina. We have had some pretty interesting experience over the last several months with the hype that's surrounding the Internet of Things, and pleased to be able to bring you a little conversation when it comes to the lighting portion of this conversation. So Tim, why don't you go ahead and send off the results. I'll be able to iterate those to you.
It's calculating now. It's about 10 seconds.
Okay. So appreciate you guys going ahead and submitting this. All right, so the results, pretty straightforward here. So most of you have heard about this from about 2 years ago, which means we have a pretty well-informed group of individuals. Only a small percentage of you have actually heard about it over the last year, and another small percentage of it from a never point of view. So a good mix. I'd say the vast majority, I guess, is going to be pretty familiar with this conversation. So I'm going to press forward and start out with a quick picture, a diagram that really from our point of view here means nothing more than what you're looking at is an image of connectivity. And connectivity of just about any device that we currently use in our world today, whether it be phones, whether it be computers, whether it be devices that are actually connected to some of our appliances, whatever it might represent is indicated there by a clear dot. There are some estimates that by the 2020 time frame, there roughly is going to be about 20-some billion interconnections. That was a result of one analyst doing their surveys, and then the other survey that I read just recently estimates that same number in 2020 to be roughly 100 billion connected devices. And for all of us that are living our personal lives, that's probably pretty well understood, but in the corporate sense, that's probably not something you would anticipate. So what is the promise of the Internet of Things? First of all, it's the ability for any device to talk to another device, or for any human, any person, to be able to also reach out to that device in order for us to be sharing of information, sharing commands, asking for some information that might be relative to our business, or it might be something that actually the buildings require in order to do its function day to day. It also is a mechanism to standardize. So when we think about how many different manufacturers come to play in this world, there has to be some mechanism, some means of being able to allow everyone to communicate with each other through some format, and usually standardization is a good thing in a lot of cases, and certainly for the Internet of Things, it's going to be really a requirement to be able to move the yardsticks forward. The net benefit that we're all going to see from the Internet of Things is specifically to the building, and we'll refer to it as the building's Internet of Things, is lower operating costs. Think of making decisions, think of not having to make a decision personally and allowing sensors and computers and devices to make those decisions for you to maximize the overall efficiency of a building. And the last part of that statement is the further development of smart buildings. So effectively, when we go forward in time, a building will consist of more and more incredible means of being able to interact. Most of us probably walk through an access reader at your doors. You probably also have lights that are turning on and off for you. Those are all components of a smart building scenario. But when all these devices and functions and applications start interconnecting and talking to each other, then you're going to have a massive amount of flexibility to optimize those buildings and also improve the overall experience of the employees, the visitors, or any of the tenants that might be in those particular buildings. And if you've been reading the funny cartoon on the right-hand side, it's not too far-fetched. I can remember roughly 7 years ago picking up one of the trade magazines, and at the time a toilet was actually introduced with an Ethernet plug that could actually measure the sugar content of the waste. And it's remarkable to think that that was actually what I found to be pretty much a joke at that time, but it's more reality than it is a joke. And there are many, many other examples that I'm sure you've probably run across in the years. So let's talk about some of the drivers and some of the systems you might be interfacing with when it comes to the Internet of Things, especially when you're in commercial spaces. So what are the drivers? I think everybody here on this call probably understands that building codes are one of the main drivers of trying to simplify and also extract as much energy efficiency out of a building as possible. The latest standard, the ASHRAE 90.1 2014, allows buildings, allows individuals to incrementally get better with energy efficiency. I was just in South Carolina, where I believe the standard still is residing at 2007. So simple implementation and abiding by some of those standards would improve the energy efficiency by 30+%. The other part of the driver scenario is just typical technology convergence. And one of the reference points I would give everybody is that if you think about the early 2000s, where most of us were probably using on our desk a hardwired phone to communicate, and over time those slowly started getting replaced with IP phone handsets. And many of you may know, or some of you may not know, that essentially you're using the Internet to make your phone calls and to actually communicate within your buildings from a desk to desk, or one campus to another campus that might be located across another part of the country, but utilizing the data network to get there. So those drivers continue to come about. Technology improves quite a bit. We've seen access points, wireless access points specifically, being installed in ceilings that are also Ethernet connected. And the one common denominator in both those cases is that power is actually being drawn from the Ethernet cable as opposed to a separate electrical conduit. Below that are systems, and these are, the first two are the most common systems that a corporate office, whatever type of vertical market you're probably working within, utilizes. Of course, number one is the largest user of any kind of energy, the HVAC system. And the second component is one of the more simplified application processes that are being utilized, which are schedulers. And if you are in a corporate office that have used things like Microsoft Outlook's calendar capability, that's essentially a scheduler, and you can do things like schedule resources or schedule rooms, and in some cases those are tied together to where you could actually activate heating and air conditioning when a room is reserved, and we're going to go into a little bit more in depth on that in a second. And the purpose of why I'm here speaking to you is now that we find the advent of LED technology, solid-state lighting in general, gives us the opportunity to interface that capability, that product, into what we now refer to as the Internet of Things, an Ethernet-attached lighting solution that is now integral to your overall building. And to be able to utilize that lighting in a much more efficient manner is really going to be the driving story behind today's presentation. So I'm going to actually back up and show you a picture here. What you see on your screen are two sets of cables. I certainly remember those from days ago. I still see them in some installations. On the left-hand side is your typical rat's nest of things that you would find in a closet as you run a bunch of cables together. On the right-hand side is a lot more organized methodology of running cables to connections. If you recall, in the earlier picture where I showed you all the points of light, those attachments are in some cases wireless, sometimes they're Bluetooth, in a lot of cases they're wired connections. And this is what a wired connection scenario would look like within your building place. Now, why is that so? So if you look at the left-hand side of your chart, you're going to see typical building systems that were individually controlled, managed, in some cases even monitored either externally or internally by different groups within your business. So regardless of what position you have as part of your responsibility, you may or may not be touching every one of those building systems on the left-hand side, anywhere from fire to the Wi-Fi to security cameras to access control, you name it, with all the pictures on the left-hand side. And what we're now discussing and what is now happening in real time is this idea of a single converged network within the corporations, and that converged network looks very similar to what's illustrated here. Essentially, everybody is attached to the backbone of an Ethernet network. And those connections, again, could be physical, they could be wireless, but essentially they're all sharing the same type of backbone. That's true convergence. And today, and within recent time, we've been able to now add the lighting component to that backbone network to be able to not only source my electricity to drive my lights, but also interact a lot more efficiency with my lights for an optimal building operation over time. So left-hand side, probably a lot of you may still be in that circumstance. Right-hand side, you're probably on the bleeding edge of some of the technologies that are being implemented there, or probably in the process of looking at or planning for implementation for a converged environment. So let's talk about the why lighting side of the story. Number one and number two of the things that are printing or painting on your screen right now are relative to consumption. So look on the left-hand side, you can see that literally 23% of all global electricity is in commercial buildings. So you think about our work life, you also think about the school systems, hospitals, healthcare. Just about every close to 24-hour operation from a commercial standpoint is consuming a great amount of energy. A large portion of that, greater than 60%, is servicing the HVAC system. The largest next percentage is driven by the lighting. So we feel, like most people will feel, like you walk into a building, you need to have lights to operate. And lights become more mission critical as we move on, and people rely more on proper lighting within their buildings in order to do their jobs. The second egg that's shown here at 40% is the cost, the operational cost of electricity within that building, specifically keeping the lights on. So a fairly hefty amount of your day or your monthly expense is going to the operation of lights. Now, in some cases, that's because there is incumbent technology installed that is utilizing a lot more electricity than what could be with an LED technology, but that's the reality. Not everybody has converted over to the energy efficiency of LEDs, so we have to live in sort of this hybrid state of affairs where we're slowly integrating new technology while operating old technology. Now, on the right-hand side, the next three eggs are basically showing you some of the other major factors that have come to play. So the LED light that you may have been familiar with on the initial introduction of LEDs, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer, was much more efficient than the incumbent technology that it was replacing, but is even the newest technology rolling out the doors today from manufacturers is even much more efficient and capable, and the cost of those items to be actually manufactured are dropping pretty significantly. Here you show 12% year over year, so you can imagine how that compounds and puts a lot more money in our pockets. Power efficiency improves greatly. An LED that we installed outdoors probably is maybe 50% less efficient than what an LED outdoors could be today. Even on the indoor standpoint, that's about the same. And then the last bullet, basically, or the last egg here, shows you that of the amount of shares or amount of fixtures that are going to be installed, only approximately 50% is targeted by 2020. So we have a run rate of about another 4 years. The numbers for LED penetration within the United States, within the world, have hovered around the single digits, maybe 10% at the most in some cases, but they vary greatly depending on the type of research document you're reading. The reality is that unless you're in the business with LEDs, you're probably not operating in a 100% LED world, but that will soon change for a lot of us as we, again, recognize the benefits of the lighting technology going forward. So this is more of like an agenda slide of things that we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. So if you look at the top row, you're going to see things like energy is costing roughly $3 a square foot per year. Real estate on average is around $30 a square foot per year, and the cost of putting an employee in that space is roughly $300 a square foot per year. A little bit is that technology, a little bit is that of the actual furniture space and other things that might play in. Now, with the idea of this concept of putting lighting within your ceiling, there are a couple things that to look at. And on the bottom row, you're actually going to see that their ability to enhance your user experience. How can you make your employee feel more comfortable, be more productive, perhaps be a little bit more attentive to the details of his or her work? That's one aspect that we're going to take a look at. The middle is more of the no-brainer of the world when it comes to LEDs, and that is to lower total costs. So again, being able to cut costs by using the LED and then also controlling that LED is going to be a really massive amount of savings. And then the last part is the ability to actually interact with those lights, with the actual fixtures. The endpoints that are on the end of these Ethernet cables are all capable of being addressed with an IP address, a specific IP address, to be able to look up information, exchange data, pass information back and forth in order to react and to process the changes that need to occur within the building. So we're going to take each one of those categories and break it down for you a little bit more. So let's talk a little about end user experience. So what you see on the left-hand side is a typical office, and office that's facing, maybe it's facing the south side of the building, so you're going to get a lot of sun. So you have a situation where you have light coming in, and you have certain intensities and certain color temperatures that you might prefer. When you think about how our information about ourselves is already programmed into the system, there are ways of actually linking those persons, that particular person's preferences, into basically a computer or even registered within a scheduling system that can alter the overall look and feel of that environment at a certain time. So in this particular case, if your screens are showing it, it actually went to a much cooler color. So you see a little bit more of a blue look inside of it. So I'm walking into my room, it recognizes that I've walked into the room and it's changed the color temperature to something that I prefer. So a much cooler look, a much more brighter environment, and that's the way I prefer it. Now, for others, it may not be exactly the same. In some cases, you might have a temperature preference in a particular room. I know that, I just walked in from one building to another and I was sitting with some friends, and as we sat down in one conference room, some said, wow, it's cold in here. Some said, wow, it's feeling kind of warm in here. So obviously, we all have a personal preference on temperatures. How cool would it be for the temperature to actually be registered based, again, on your profile and be able to adjust itself by sensoring within the lights to actually tell the temperature settings to change, whether to either a cooler or to a warmer mode. And then finally, since there's so much technology that's pervasive in our buildings, whether you're carrying around a tablet, you have an IP phone on your desk, you have your computer, to also be able to acknowledge that when I plug in that phone or when I access a wireless access point, to actually pull up all my relative information. For instance, if that particular office space that we're looking at is more of a hotel-like scenario where you just drop in and utilize an office for a period of time, we can have these things preset. So as you walk in, everything is set up so all you have to do is when you pick up your phone, you have your directory available to you and you can dial out. This is done not by magic, not by smoke and mirrors. It's done by the intellectual transactions between what's happening within that building, all done based on Ethernet. Essentially, you can have the lights would be tied to the Ethernet scenario. You have the lights tied to the heating and air conditioning system to be able to react, and also tie into the scheduling and the directory information to be able to tell that individual the information he needs to process. Let's look at another example. This is really common, certainly common in my office place. You might be in a conference room where you're a single person just using the conference room to do a presentation or to have a conversation over an audio bridge. In that particular case, there's really not much going on. You don't really feel any changes. The temperature and the light output might be more than adequate. You don't really need to do any modifications. But let's say that same space is being utilized for a bigger meeting, let's say a department meeting, and you're adding 5 other individuals. In a sense, you're adding 5 more individuals of heat-generating capabilities that is going to change the overall environment. No matter how big or small that particular space is, it's going to have an adjustment. Sensoring capabilities within the ceiling, specifically within the lights or near the lights, can also basically pass that information on to the HVAC system to adjust output, make it cooler, make it warmer. As long as you have a steady level of temperature, most people are going to be comfortable with that environment. So let's look at another statistic that's come up. It's that when we find that employees are feeling better about their environments, we're seeing an uptick of around 16% increase in productivity. Now that's relative to some analysis done, and this is not all internal analysis by ourselves. This is done by the industry, the building institutes, and they find that any creature comforts that an employee can find to benefit him will help improve his overall efficiency. Not to even say one of the basic things about LED lighting is that it makes individuals a lot more attentive to their work because they don't get fatigued by the incumbent technology that might be in those offices, whether it be the wrong color, whether it be noisy, whether it be flashing and creating headaches or problems when you're reading your computer screens. So lots of ways of looking at this, but the net of it is, if you can control your environment, control the actual workplace, and adapt it to what individuals like to operate within, you're going to net out a better benefit of productivity for those individuals. Now, the other side of the story, of course, from the CFO is going to be a huge improvement in the overall energy use by those particular spaces. In a lot of cases, if rooms are not occupied, they'll be dimmed down or they'll actually be shut off. Temperatures can actually be turned down to a relatively a relative number that's not going to create any problems, create any extra heat or extra cooling, and all that factors into the bottom line, which is an easy business case to illustrate to any individual. When you implement lighting technology like LED, you almost immediately get a 50% benefit in your electrical costs, even if they're on exactly the same amount of time that the incumbent technology was installed. But once you implement control technology and you interact all these particular systems together, you just have an unlimited amount of opportunity to save anywhere up to 90%, even more in some cases, of where your costs would have been in previous years. So one last thing here to illustrate is something called technology, specifically technology that we may have used so many years ago that we all take for granted that we probably have gone through those stepping stones. So one of the things for sure is that, the wired technology that we utilize for computers have converted essentially, or the more cumbersome, larger technology is now converted into something a lot more sleek and designed a lot more easier for us to interact with our corporate lives. And in this case, what we're illustrating here is that when you have a smart building, no matter where you are in that building, you basically have access to your information. It's not residing on your desktop and you can't move around because the thing that is actually tethered to that particular location, extra cabling, extra wires, that have all been utilized in order to drive the cost of that particular product. So what you're seeing up in the ceiling here is a bunch of electrical power, conduit having to be placed on it to be building code specific, which is really significant. And for those of you that actually practice the idea of being an electrical contractor, you know the cost of having to run those cables up, high voltage cables up in the ceiling. Imagine, if you will, if you converted a building or converted either doing a new installation or doing a renovation, and parts of what you're going to be installing is essentially low-powered connections via Ethernet, Cat5 and Cat6 cables that are going to be running to all these devices. And in the ceiling, you're going to be attaching to lights, which traditionally have been powered by 120 to 277 building power, and required a pretty significant individual to do that installation and all the ancillary products that are required to run it. So things change really dramatically when you go to an Ethernet cable. Not only does it become a more sleek type of interface, but it also is going to be, again, low voltage. You can certainly pull cables a lot easier in this particular fashion than you would have to run electrical wires through a building set. So, bottom line for this side of it now is the analytics. Now, what can I do once I have a building that's super intelligent? Can I interact with that building? And of course, the answer is yes, because once you have the addressability of every device within that building, you can interact with it. Maybe you can make some modifications that are above and beyond what we've discussed here. Perhaps you can even utilize some of the analytics for security purposes. As an example, we've talked to some customers who are interested in actually sequencing the lights at a certain flash for security purposes in areas that no one should be in proximity to a certain location. So if I am monitoring a building, or if I am a custodian and I'm walking around and I notice something changing within a building, like the lights flashing a certain sequence, that could alert me to something that could be problematic. Now, maybe it's not. Maybe it's a rodent. Maybe it's something that has triggered it, but at least it's given me an indication that something that's irregular in that particular office space needs to be addressed. The idea of analytics in general is what the building block is of this whole story of the Internet of Things, specifically for buildings. Being able to interact with devices, again, from desktop all the way to ceiling, into the HVAC system, to security access control, really is going to be the nirvana for a lot of operators, and also for individuals that are looking at ways of reducing energy as well as giving back in terms of sustainability. So light transformation specifically, and we've been addressing this as part of the conversation anyway, the one piece that we really haven't talked to in any great sense is the controllability and the responsibility of the functionality of lighting within these spaces. So traditional lighting on your left-hand side has largely been the responsibility of facility managers, anybody that's a plant manager or an operation manager They typically control the responsibilities of installing, repairing, replacing, relamping, whatever the case might be. That's the individual that gets the ticket that says to go out and actually do the installation of the lighting systems. The IT department would probably venture to guess that never has been involved in that up until recently. And the reason being is that their sole prime responsibility has been the general operation and the mission criticalness of an Ethernet or the corporate internet connectivity of all the spaces across the board. So whether it be offices, conference rooms, wherever that might be, those individuals have their own priorities, their own ticket systems in some cases, and the two shall never cross. Well, that's changed, and it's going to change really rapidly because now we're in the second transformation of LED lighting, where we're now utilizing the solid-state electronics that were incorporated into these lights to be able to do more than just turn on and off and be able to provide a decent amount of light. So we go above and beyond that. We as in the industry for lighting, when you think about something as significant as taking on the responsibility of putting lighting onto a backbone network, you can imagine the angst that some individuals might be feeling. So you have IT individuals that are now going to have to understand how lighting works and how they might want to control those lights and actually become familiar with the element management systems that are controlling those lights. Conversely, you have facility managers that might be a little bit concerned that the responsibility they have had for so many years has now become more of an IT responsibility because of the connectivity. Now, that's not going to be an emphatic situation with everybody. There's going to be happy mediums, but the point of this particular slide is that there has to be some level of interaction between individuals going further. You might find yourselves more and more pulling IT individuals, IT experienced individuals into your lighting world, and the IT staffs might be reaching further into the lighting world or into the facility teams to pull individuals and their understanding not only of lighting but of HVAC and access control and other components that were largely not their responsibility on a day-to-day basis. So whether you call it first transformation, second transformation, or the evolution of lighting or the evolution of the intelligent building, this is the reality. This is the same reality that was faced in the early 2000s when the telephony world was actually merged onto the IT world. If you know anybody or if you were those individuals at that time, I'm sure you probably have stories that could last a little while on this phone call, indicating the stress and the overall challenges that were put in place when you had to actually sit down and have a conversation with each other to be able to make things work effectively. And I'll use the word mission critical again because what essentially we're doing is as we're driving everything to be on one corporate backbone, not only the electricity but the communication, we're making every component essentially mission critical to the operation of that commercial office building. So let's talk a little bit about something that really is instrumental in making this work, and that's power over Ethernet. And I could equally have asked the question in the early slide that said, are you familiar with the term power over Ethernet? I suspect most of you would have answered it similarly. That's a very common terminology. You might even have some of this implemented within your own house. But essentially, the things you need to know about power over Ethernet is that it's been a standard for a while. The standard has largely been utilized to power phones, like we talked about earlier, largely used to power wireless access points that are plugged into your ceiling, and sometimes utilized for other components, perhaps security cameras are one of those things that you have looked at utilizing. The claim to fame is the fact that an Ethernet switch, a power over Ethernet switch, has the ability of driving a direct current, electricity, essentially to those devices for them to operate. Now, in most cases, where the world was in 2003 is that 30 watts was the maximum amount of power that was being pushed out of an Ethernet switch based on the standard. In order to be able to support other technologies, as an example, an LED light that may be operating, let's say, at 44 watts or even an outdoor light that is even higher wattage, you're going to need to drive a large amount of power out of these Ethernet switches. So there is an activity within the IEEE, which really governs a lot of the activity associated with connectivity within the data world. They're working on a standard that will push the wattage capabilities as high as we possibly can get, and some think over 100 watts, maybe more. But the stepping stone that we're going to be reaching out to is something that's being referred to as UPoE. So it is essentially a pre-standard implementation of a 60-watt power over Ethernet capability set. And essentially that is what we're going to be leveraging. That is most of what everybody in this industry is leveraging at this point to be able to tie things like lighting onto a corporate network. So as you can see in the picture, you're looking at the various components of what would be considered a power over Ethernet solution. One thing I'll point out here is that, and a question that might come up a little later in the presentation or in Q&A, is the idea of any kind of battery backup. We're very familiar in the lighting world with doing battery backup for specific fixtures within your building, but what happens now when none of your lights are attached to the electricity? You have to incorporate some of that mentality within the Ethernet network, and one of the most common rules within the data networking world is that you have a UPS system that is effectively capable of backing up your corporate network. In a sense, that protects us in the lighting business as well, that there will always be enough power to be able to generate light within a building. So we talked about this. I actually got a little ahead of myself from the conversation on PoE, but you can see the numbers there that we've increased the wattage coming out of the PoE from 30 to 60. The PoE Cat5, Cat6 connection is carrying not only the power with it, but it also is carrying all the analytics, all the conversations, the network management related information that's being extracted in both directions. The thing to really consider, though, as you look at the bottom bullet, is that you can largely save more money by implementing the LED lighting with controls in this particular fashion, as opposed to having to run separate purple and gray wires, let's say from a device, a switch on the wall, up to your ceiling for dimming capabilities or occupancy sensors. So there are some caveats that we have to look at, and there are some trade-offs from a product point of view, that there might be some higher priced product on the Ethernet side, but that gets basically minimized by the fact that there's a heck of a lot labor that's associated with the implementation in this particular fashion. So less labor costs, maybe a little bit higher product costs, but even the product costs are drastically coming down. So a little bit more visualization showing you what's involved in delivering a solution like this. So top left, as we've talked about, there are products, manufacturers that actually manufacture a power over Ethernet switch, and sometimes they are different from a standard Ethernet switch that might be in a closet. So there are different port sizes. Sometimes you can actually terminate as many as 10 to 15 of these on a particular switch, and sometimes it might even be higher if you get a larger switch that can fit into your closet. The type of lights and dimmers that you're going to be able to utilize, anywhere from a standard troffer, are very typical today to be able to power under 60 watts. Think about if you have some knowledge of manufacturers' LED lighting, you probably can idealize what is going to work here, whether it's a downlight that only uses maybe 8 or 10 watts per downlight, a particular troffer that's operating at 40 watts. You might be able to even go into parking garages where there's 30-some watts being utilized by some of these fixtures, but you're certainly not going to go out to a location where you're going to have an exterior light that's running at 233 watts. So it is very fixed on a certain wattage capacity within the LED world. The next box on the right is common management tools. So not only will your lights be manageable, but you're also going to have the ability to do some maintenance on those lights. So as an example, if there are changes, improvements, software improvements that are incorporated into the drivers of the lights, you have the ability of just doing a simple update to those lights to actually do some some different things. Maybe they will sequence differently. Maybe the color will change a little bit more dramatically, or maybe you can set the colors a lot easier. So lots of different ways of actually manipulating the fixtures within the ceiling. Your base energy savings, as we talked about, come from just standard occupancy sensors. They can also come from daylight harvesting. But again, working with something along the HVAC system or with schedulers, we even enable you even more to take advantage of that. So if you look at the advanced energy savings, to be able to do task tuning within a certain part of the day or in a certain portion of the building that you know is not being utilized, you can set those parameters to act within a minute's notice of being able to make a change instead of having to go pre-program, or in some cases even asking somebody to come in and make those changes on your behalf. And really the nirvana is the last bullet, is the full integration for a back office system, for a BMS, for any kind of IT integration, all the different manufacturers that work there, the Honeywells, the Siemens of the world, that basically are the ones that have been controlling the HVAC systems and any other kind of power integration within your buildings. And being able to do this with something as simple as an API, and the term API is an application program interface. It is basically an open standard, an open language that enables anybody and everybody that wants to create some kind of effect within their building of Internet of Things to change the way things operate or interact or interwork. You have that ability utilizing this API, and for most cases an API is free to program against. You can request it from any of the manufacturers, and you can essentially make yourself a middleware designer, a middleware software developer to make things happen a little quicker within your buildings. So getting close to the end of this, so quick summary information here. So looking at considerations and benefits, didn't emphasize this, but I will now, that if you think about a building construction, the easiest way to implement something like a PoE solution, an Internet of Things concept, is when the building is just being constructed, or when you have a scenario where there's really heavy renovation and that ceiling panels are being dropped. Perhaps you're rerunning all kinds of conduit and cable that maybe doesn't need to be rerun, and you can replace it with Cat5 or Cat6 cables. In our world today, in the lighting world, we see a very heavy amount of renovation still happening compared to new construction, but we do believe that the percentages are changing over time. They're creeping closer and closer together, but we're still roughly at 20% new construction versus the other 80% doing renovations. Another factor which, as a contractor, as an electrical contractor, as somebody that does commissioning of lighting systems, it is going to be so much easier for you to be able to commission a network in this way. When you have lights that are attached via cable and communicating over the Ethernet, you can be anywhere you want to be, whether you're across the street at the Starbucks or whether you're somewhere located within the building campus. You have the ability to attach and do whatever you need to do to the lights for the initial commissioning, for the ongoing changes that might occur. We just talked about the back office integration, absolutely a huge benefit, one that's rarely being able to be implemented unless you have a lot of ancillary devices and gateways and all kinds of interesting things plugged into your closet system, going into your lighting system and also going into your back office. So a heck of a lot easier to do that. UPS enabled, as I mentioned earlier. You don't need to have separate runs. Effectively, if you can back up your Ethernet switch, you have backed up as many lights that are on that Ethernet switch, and of course you could segregate those lights in any fashion you want in order to run from one location to another in the building. Measurement and verification, this is the analytics story, so being able to collect as much data as I would want during a time frame. A lot of cases, systems are designed to maybe sample every 15 minutes. Well, how about sampling every minute and making changes? May sound like a lot, but it gives you that flexibility to interpret and incorporate as much as you want in your thought process of how to measure the actual utilization of a space. You can get very, very granular. Reacts to demand and response, just like you would expect. Again, through the API, you can make some changes there. And the idea of task tuning, again, making it comfortable for individuals individually or based on a section of a building at a time. So massively easy to do this when you have the system in this configuration. So that wraps it up, and I wanted to finish with just a simple poll question here, and this one's a little longer to read, so we'll have a little time for you guys to answer. So give it some thought. Which of the following statements best describes your thoughts as to the impact of the IoT on lighting specifically? So you think about your answers. Number one, it's way too early in the game to pass judgment, right? Many of you, again, may have just heard of this term or just recently experienced the term and understanding and how this works, so maybe you don't really have a good feel. Maybe some of you understand the potential benefits and you want to still dig into this a little bit more, see how this might affect you if you're responsible for certain building operations. This is certainly something you should put on your list for a little bit more investigation. Some of you might think this is a little bit nuts. Interesting, but the mix of lighting in the IT world is a major hurdle, right? How are we ever going to get over that particular hurdle of being able to get these two groups to communicate? It's not typical. It certainly hasn't been typical. It's going to require us to be open to change and willing to be able to interact with each other. Some of you maybe have already implemented this. So maybe this conversation just reinforces a lot of what you've already experienced, and if you opt for selection number 4, then essentially you already know what the benefit is. And of course, number 5, giving everybody an out, none of the above. Okay, so let's close the poll, Tim, and let's see what we have here. Let's do its calculations. And as we're doing this, this is my last slide, so we're going to dedicate the next few minutes for any questions. So if you have some questions that you would like to submit, please utilize the interface in the system, in the WebEx system. So the results being, so looks like, if I read this correctly, so there is virtually a tie between option number 2 and option number 4. So it looks like most of you are feeling that you got some of the potential benefits or you've already implemented them, so that's a good sign. So thank you for that. Thank you for playing with the polls and giving us some feedback and allowing us to share that. So with that, I'll wrap it, and we'll go to Q&A and look forward to a little bit more conversation with you guys.
Awesome, John. Thanks for the presentation. It was really comprehensive. I think anybody coming in here who didn't know anything about the IoT and lighting could have, learned a lot. And I think anybody who knew a little bit or even a lot could have come in and learned some things. So, thanks. I did get a couple of some really interesting questions. One of the ones that I really liked the best was, it's a pretty loaded question. What are the top 3 advantages of these systems? And they want to know what's the best way to make a case to the owner quickly. I think I liked it because I think I've heard it called an elevator pitch.
Yeah.
So what's the best way to get to the point in selling these systems?
So really, I'll group it into the 3 that we defined it on the slide. So number 1 is the ability to do full control for end user benefits. So as much as we like to think squeezing energy efficiency out of a building does a lot for your bottom line just for the energy side of it, but it doesn't necessarily make everybody comfortable and feel like they're feeling good about themselves or their work within their spaces. So having full control of an actual fixture within a territory that a person's working, allowing them to customize it, to be able to give them the full benefit of making them feel as comfortable as possible to generate more productivity is really key. So how do you quantify that? Well, there are statistics. The 16% improvement that saw on the slides is a number that's backed by some research. So perhaps you can use that 16% and see if there's an incremental value that you can show. Certainly, I'd be remiss in not talking about energy efficiency. So we've been working with controls for a long time. One of the secret stories behind this overall concept of the Internet of Things is that you have an endless amount of potential when you put something like a light in the ceiling that has the ability to interact. And most of us understand that occupancy sensors and daylighting sensors are the typical things that we utilize. But how about implementing things like potentially cameras inside the systems? How about implementing something like CO2 monitors for some environments? How about the ability to actually identify temperatures at a place or a certain level of temperature that would indicate there's an intrusion? So security comes into play here a great deal. So not only can we generate a lot of great energy efficiency, but we just have created a platform, just an amazing amount of additional things. So to the person that asked that question, what I would say is that this is one of the few technologies that will be future-proof in implementation. So attach an Ethernet cable to a light, that light will have a long-standing world in there. And then the final statement would be the only way to really develop really good statistical data is to be able to extract that information directly from the source. Today you can only predict it. Typically most people will go to the source of the power coming into the building, and they have to put all kinds of devices on those feeds in order to understand the power consumption. Don't really need to do that anymore. You can use something as simple as a connection to your light and your heating and air conditioning, and pull out your smartphone and essentially get day-to-day, minute-to-minute, maybe even seconds kind of responses. So that's the value of how this building IoT concept will benefit all of us moving forward.
Perfect. Another question, well, there's a couple questions about code and compliance issues. So can you discuss any code or compliance issues in deploying PoE lighting, and specifically where is the lighting industry in embracing PoE?
Let me take the last first, and then we'll talk a little bit about code. So the lighting industry has embraced the power over Ethernet concept, specifically the vendors that are manufacturing LED technologies. And there are quite a few, as many of you already know. There's many of us out here. So it's very logical for a lighting company, an LED lighting company, to embrace this, because this plays directly into the strengths of this technology. It's solid-state electronics. There's no pieces that don't allow me to interpret or to manipulate. I can do really massive manipulation of data because I'm essentially controlling it with software anyway within the driver. So that's the piece in terms of the industry. I think you'll find that very popular. For those of you that are Cisco informed or Cisco users within your corporate offices, easily just take a quick rundown to the website, their digital ceiling website, and you'll see us listed along with many, many different vendors, not just lighting vendors, but all kinds of vendors that are embracing this technology. Now to the standards question. So there's some things that are still yet to really be fleshed out. I will tell you that most of us have incorporated basic capabilities within our products to be able to claim something like along the lines of we are ASHRAE 90.1 2013 compliant, which means that our products can operate within 0.5 watts per square foot. If you remember that there are all kinds of ranges that go into play when you have incumbent lighting, but if you can reduce your energy to basically just using 0.5 per square foot, then you're in really great shape, and most of us are there. There's still some play in terms of the overall output power that's required for LEDs. So think about one of the things I referenced earlier. We have a lot of great technology in the world, and a lot of the technologies have improved so greatly that when you say that you have saved 50% of the capacity of a light, let's say like if you're on you're at a parking lot or a sales lot at a car dealership, and you're on the front line, and there's potentially two 1,000-watt metal halide lights that are in place there, and you can replace 2,000 watts with maybe an 800-watt LED, which gives you significant savings, but it's still not capable of being sourced by a power over Ethernet solution set. So there's still work to be done there, and from my understanding, the IEEE is already continuing on beyond the 60 and the 100-watt levels, and they're looking at ways of incorporating newer and greater things.
Okay, great. So here's the next one. So it's about networking. So the system runs over the network. Does each light get an IP address? If so, do you set up a separate network just for the lighting so that you aren't using all of your 254 addresses on the lights? Please explain.
Yeah, good question. Really good question. It gets into the IT side of the storyline. So let me give you a little bit more direct information. So each light in your location would actually have a single Cat5, Cat6 cable that is pulled directly off of an Ethernet switch. And you could regionalize your Ethernet switches, and essentially once those connections are done, then essentially you would put things like, you put a VLAN together essentially to accommodate just your lighting network, just as similar as you VLAN most of your IP network for voice. Sorry, VLAN your voice over an IP network. So to that particular person asking the question, I think if you have some of that background, then you understand, yeah, you can segregate the lighting very easily, and you can deploy thousands without ever jeopardizing your situation with IP addresses.
Okay. Another more technical specific question, can multiple lights be connected on one line daisy-chained, or is it all home runs?
So that's a really good question. That is something that's hard in the development of most of us trying to figure out how to make that work. And essentially today's world is everyone is a home run. But I'll go back to an example just to let that person know that the industry is thinking through this. If I have 30 watts, even if I have, if I had 60 watts, even if I had 30 watts, I could fit a lot of downlights on a one run. But the problem is going to be is that the path is still a single Ethernet cable path. Essentially, it won't allow me to daisy chain and drop the voltage on each one. So it's a little trickier than just saying we're going to do a multi-drop scenario on an Ethernet cable. That probably will require perhaps even another category of cabling to allow that to happen. Okay.
So it's sort of the state of the technology at this point, right?
That's right.
Okay. Okay, so we do have a few more really good questions, but I think I'm going to close it out with one final one since it's now 3:02. This one is, does Cree offer an IoT platform, not just the lighting management, but other devices and sensors?
Yes, the answer is yes, and it's available to anybody if they'd like to go to the website. You can see a whole listing of the products that are supported. It's PoE based, and the solution interacts with most of the products that you would expect in a corporate IT infrastructure. So you absolutely can go look at that on our website.
Perfect. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. I really want to thank everybody for sticking with us through the technical difficulties at the beginning, but I think everything else afterward went off the hitch. On behalf of Electrical Contractor, I want to thank everyone once again for attending, sticking with us. I also want to thank John Casadante from Cree for an excellent presentation. Be on the lookout for the recording of this event, which you'll be notified about in an email, hopefully within the next 72 hours. And we hope to see you again in a future webinar. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.